When Donald Trump stands at a podium and declares a war very much complete far ahead of schedule and destined to resolve very soon, he isn't describing reality so much as trying to manufacture it by sheer force of repetition, bravado, and political intimidation. In the remarks captured in the transcript you provided, Trump doesn't just claim sweeping battlefield dominance. He narrates a cinematic victory, Iran's Navy on the bottom of the sea missile, capabilities allegedly reduced to a trickle, leadership gone, thousands of targets struck, and a looming threat to take over the Middle East, supposedly neutralized in days. He then pivots almost casually to the domestic political dividend. He's waiving certain oil-related sanctions to push prices down, offering risk insurance for tankers in the Gulf, and threatening apocalyptic retaliation if Iran touches the Strait of Hormuz. This is the Trump doctrine in its purest form: turn war into branding, turn global instability into a campaign prop, and dare anyone, Congress, the press, allies, even basic arithmetic, to contradict the story. But the problem for Trumpism is that geopolitics does not care about a press conference. Oil markets don't move because the president says, don't worry. They move because traders see risk that can't be wished away. Over the last 48 hours, the public has watched precisely that whiplash crude spiking on fear of disruption and then dropping sharply after Trump teased a fast end to the conflict, an admission in market terms that the system believes this war could still break wider or narrow quickly, depending on the next impulsive decision. And Reuters reporting today describes Iran vowing continued pressure around Middle East oil exports until attacks stop, with Trump counter-threatening heavier strikes, exactly the kind of escalation ladder that turns very soon into we're stuck here. So let's name what's happening. Trump is trying to sell Americans a fairy tale of decisive power. We struck, we won, we're done. And anyone who questions it is unpatriotic or hates the country or is part of a shutdown or is lying for the opposition. In the transcript, he even swings wildly between the big risk on that war has been over for 3 days. And we're going to go further, which is not an operational plan so much as a confession that the story changes with the political moment. That rhetorical slippage matters because it reveals the truth MAGA media tries to bury. When a leader treats war as a performance, the mission becomes whatever line reads best on television today, and the costs become a problem for tomorrow. What makes this especially dangerous is that Trump's approach weaponizes uncertainty in two directions at once. Externally, it signals to adversaries and allies that U.S. policy can hinge on one man's mood and one news cycle's optics. Internally, it trains the public to accept wartime claims that are unverifiable in real time while punishing scrutiny as disloyalty. It is not strength. It is a political technique. Flood the zone with declarations so sweeping that rebuttal feels impossible, then use the lack of immediate rebuttal as proof the declarations were true. You can see the scaffolding of that technique inside the transcript itself. Trump boasts about striking over 5,000 targets, keeping most important targets for later, and suggests he can devastate Iran's electricity production in 1 day if he chooses. That isn't merely tough talk. It's an escalation threat with massive humanitarian implications delivered like a casual aside. Then he claims the U.S. is offering political risk insurance for tankers in the Gulf, effectively socializing war risk onto the American public while insisting the conflict doesn't really affect us because we have so much oil. Reuters and other outlets have indeed reported the U.S. using government-backed mechanisms to support Gulf shipping amid disruption fears, underscoring that the danger is real enough to require extraordinary financial backstops. And then comes the bait and switch. Trump suggests lifting or waiving oil-related sanctions to reduce prices. That idea is not hypothetical. Multiple outlets have reported him floating sanctions relief and waivers tied to oil market stabilization. This is the part that should set off alarms for anyone who's been paying attention for the last decade. Trump is treating sanctions, one of the United States' most serious foreign policy tools, as a throttle for domestic gas prices and political optics. In other words, he's willing to rewrite coercive diplomacy on the fly, not based on strategy or allied coordination, but based on what makes a better headline and quiets a spike at the pump. Democrats have been warning about this exact pattern since Trump's first term. He conflates national power with personal power. He treats the state like a lever for his own reputation. He makes threats not to create leverage for diplomacy, but to project dominance for an audience. When you fuse that impulse with a war, you get a president narrating his own victory while the world tries to calculate the real risk of the next strike. There's another layer here, and it's the constitutional one. Republicans keep dodging. The GOP that spent years screaming about executive authority suddenly goes silent when the executive authority is theirs. That silence isn't just hypocrisy, it's institutional surrender. War powers are not a collectible. Congress exists to debate, authorize, limit, fund, and oversee the use of force, especially when the president's statements oscillate between "we're finished" and "we're going further." If Trump is promising Americans this ends very soon, lawmakers should demand specifics. What constitutes success? What constitutes the end point? What are the conditions for ceasefire? What are the triggers for escalation? What is the plan for regional retaliation? And what's the estimate of civilian harm and displacement? Instead, too many Republicans treat questions like that as sabotage because MAGA politics has trained them to view oversight as betrayal. And look at the propaganda loop Trump tries to build right there in the transcript. Asked about U.S. fatalities, he invokes Dover and says every grieving parent told him, "Finish the job, sir." That's a powerful image, and it may reflect what some families say in some moments, but it is also a classic rhetorical move rap, an open-ended military commitment in the moral shield of bereaved parents, and dare the public to object. The problem is that "finish the job" is not a policy, it's a slogan. Slogans do not prevent blowback. Secure shipping lanes keep regional partners stable or rebuild deterrence without triggering wider war. Meanwhile, reality keeps intruding. Reuters reporting today describes Iran insisting the oil blockade pressure will continue until attacks end, while Trump threatens harsher strikes. The Guardian describes the market's violent swing, oil plunging from spikes after Trump's very soon remarks as if traders are betting on words while bracing for deeds. This is what instability looks like. The world cannot tell whether the next 24 hours brings a de-escalatory channel or another round of strikes that pushes the region toward a broader conflagration. That uncertainty itself becomes a weapon against ordinary people because the costs are immediate: higher transport costs, higher food prices, stressed supply chains, and governments forced into emergency price controls and austerity measures. And then there's the moral hazard of Trump's insurance posture. Offering political risk insurance for tankers, promising naval escorts, and warning Iran that disruption will trigger devastating retaliation might sound like resolve, but it's also an admission we are now underwriting and militarizing global commerce in a conflict zone because the situation is so precarious that private actors won't bear the risk. That is not normal. It's an emergency adaptation to a crisis, one that can spiral if any actor miscalculates, if any missile hits the wrong target, if any strike causes mass casualties that demand revenge. Now let's address the part Trump wants Americans to ignore. The very soon promise is politically functional precisely because it is strategically evasive. It is designed to collapse time. If the war is almost over, then oversight can wait. If it's a brief excursion, then debate is unnecessary. If everything they have is gone, then skepticism is naive. And if the war later drags on, Trump can simply say the blame lies elsewhere: disloyal generals, fake news Democrats, allies, or Iran's lunatics. This is the same accountability dodge we've watched in every Trump crisis. Claim total control until something goes wrong, then claim total victimhood. MAGA media will amplify that dodge because it serves their business model and their ideology. They need Trump to be infallible because their movement has fused personal loyalty with national identity. In that worldview, acknowledging uncertainty is weakness, acknowledging complexity is elitism, and acknowledging civilian suffering is propaganda. It's the politics of emotional certainty over empirical reality. And it is how democracies stumble into strategic disasters, not because voters are evil, but because leaders and media ecosystems train them to prefer comforting narratives to hard truths. Hard truth number one is that wars with Iran, direct wars, not proxy skirmishes, are inherently escalatory and regionally contagious. Even if U.S.-Israel campaign achieves tactical successes, the strategic question remains, What is the political end state and who governs in the vacuum? Trump himself gestures at the nightmare by mentioning Iraq and ISIS, saying you don't want to fire everyone and create chaos, but acknowledging that lesson is not the same as applying it. If leadership is gone, as he claims, then the governance question becomes immediate, not theoretical. A destroyed command structure doesn't automatically produce stability. It often produces fragmentation, malicious revenge cycles, and regional proxy competition. Hard truth number 2 is that Trump's sanctions improvisation, lift them now to lower prices, maybe reimpose later, undercuts the credibility of sanctions as a tool. Allies coordinate sanctions to generate pressure, not to serve as a domestic gas price dial. When the United States uses sanctions like a campaign prop, it trains the world to treat U.S. policy as transactional and temporary. That doesn't just weaken leverage against Iran, it weakens leverage everywhere. Hard truth number 3 is that the "we're protecting the world, including China" line is not a triumph, it's an accidental confession. Trump admits the Strait of Hormuz disruption affects other countries much more than it does the United States, then frames U.S. action as a global service. But this is precisely why alliances matter, because global choke points require coordinated diplomacy and legitimate multinational frameworks, not unilateral threats and improvisation. When the U.S. acts like a lone enforcer, it invites resentment, freeloading, and opportunistic countermoves by adversaries who thrive on anti-American backlash. So here's the bottom line. Democrats should say out loud clearly without flinching, Trump's Iran war messaging is not reassurance. It is a destabilizing instrument. It asks Americans to trade skepticism for faith, oversight for applause, and constitutional governance for a strongman's narration of victory. It also tries to convert the public's fear of nuclear proliferation, fear of terrorism, fear of oil shocks, into a permission slip for open-ended force under a leader who has repeatedly shown contempt for truth, law, and democratic constraint. If Republicans had any integrity left on war and the Constitution, they would treat Trump's very soon promise as the start of the hardest questioning, not the end of it. They would demand evidence of the claimed destruction, clarity on objectives, a legal rationale, a diplomatic off-ramp, and protections against mission creep. They would insist that sanctions policy be strategic, coordinated, and tied to clear conditions, not to polling and pump prices. They would acknowledge that market volatility is a signal of danger, not a nuisance to be spun away, and they would stop pretending that bluster can substitute for planning. But MAGA politics doesn't reward integrity, it rewards submission. And that is why this moment is so perilous, not just because the Middle East is volatile, not just because oil markets are jittery, but because one of America's major political parties has trained itself to applaud rather than govern. Trump's very soon is the lullaby. The rest of us should hear it for what it is, a sedative meant to keep the public asleep while the stakes rise.